June 18, 1945, southern Okinawa. Inside a limestone cave, 16-year-old Aiko pressed her back against the cold stone wall, listening to the distant rumble of American artillery grow closer. The candles flickered, the wounded moaned, and somewhere outside, a voice called out in broken Japanese, words she had been taught never to trust. But the voice didn't sound like a monster. It sounded tired, human, almost gentle. And in that moment, as the cave trembled from another distant explosion, she realized everything she had been taught about the enemy might have been a lie. Before we continue, if stories like this one, stories that challenge what we think we know about history, move you or make you think differently, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. These stories matter because they remind us that even in the darkest chapters of human conflict, truth can shatter propaganda, and compassion can break through fear. Now, let's return to that cave, to those terrified girls, and to the moment that changed their understanding of war forever. The Battle of Okinawa began on April 1, 1945, and it would become one of the bloodiest campaigns of the Pacific War. Over 82 days, more than 12,000 American servicemen would die, and between 40 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians would perish. Caught between two massive armies fighting for control of an island barely 60 miles long. But this story isn't about generals or grand strategy. It's about a group of teenage girls conscripted as student nurses, who found themselves trapped in a cave with dying soldiers. No supplies, and a terror so deep it convinced them death was preferable to capture. They had been raised on stories that painted American soldiers as inhuman savages. They had been told surrender meant torture, humiliation, unthinkable suffering, and they believed it because they had never been given a reason to question. Aiko had been a schoolgirl just months earlier. She studied calligraphy, helped her mother with the garden, and dreamed of becoming a teacher. But when the military came to her school in early 1945, they didn't ask for volunteers. They told the girls they were needed, that their nation required their service, and that refusing would dishonor their families. So Aiko and dozens of other girls, some as young as 14, were handed white armbands with red crosses and sent to makeshift field hospitals near the front lines. They were given no real training, no proper medical supplies, and no honest explanation of what awaited them. Instead, they were given instructions on how to die. They were told that if the Americans overran their position, they should take their own lives or beg a soldier to do it for them. Better a swift death, the officers said, than what the enemy would do to them. By mid-June, the Japanese defensive lines had collapsed. The southern tip of Okinawa had become a chaotic labyrinth of caves, tunnels, and shattered hillsides where thousands of soldiers and civilians hid from American firepower. ICO's group had retreated into a limestone cave with roughly 30 wounded soldiers, a handful of officers, and 5 other student nurses. They had no morphine left, no clean bandages, and no food. The water they drank trickled from cracks in the stone, tasting of rust and earth. The men on the stretchers cried out in pain, their voices echoing off the walls. Some begged for help, others begged for death. And the girls, exhausted and terrified, did what little they could with trembling hands and tear-streaked faces. One of the girls, Yuki, barely 15 years old, had stopped speaking. She sat in the corner of the cave, her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes staring at nothing. Another girl, Hannah, whispered prayers under her breath, reciting sutras she had learned as a child. The supervising nurse, Miss Tanaka, tried to maintain order, but even she had run out of answers. When the wounded asked if help was coming, she couldn't lie convincingly anymore. Everyone knew the truth. The Japanese army was collapsing. The Americans were closing in. And surrender was not an option they had been taught to consider. Outside, the battle raged. Artillery shells screamed overhead. Machine gun fire chattered in bursts. The ground shook with each explosion, sending dust cascading from the cave ceiling. The girls flinched with every impact, their bodies curled instinctively inward, as if they could make themselves small enough to disappear. One soldier, delirious with fever, kept asking for his mother. Another, missing his left leg below the knee, stared at the cave entrance with hollow eyes, whispering that he could hear the Americans coming. And he was right. The first time Aiko heard the voice, she thought she had imagined it. The words were Japanese, but the accent was strange, the pronunciation awkward. "Come out no harm. We help." She looked at Yuki, whose eyes had widened in fear. Hana covered her mouth to stifle a sob. Miss Tanaka held up her hand, signaling silence. They all listened, barely breathing. The voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Food, water, medicine, come out." "Safe." The girls exchanged glances, confusion mixing with terror. Why would the enemy try to speak their language? Why would they promise safety? Everything they had been taught said this was a trap, a cruel trick to lure them out before the real horror began. One of the Japanese officers, his arm wrapped in a blood-soaked bandage, stumbled toward the entrance and shouted back in defiance. He told the girls to prepare to move deeper into the tunnels to avoid capture at all costs. He repeated the orders they had heard 100 times before. Surrender was betrayal. Capture was worse than death, and the Americans would show no mercy. But his voice cracked as he spoke, and his eyes betrayed his own fear. He knew they were trapped. He knew there was nowhere left to run. And he knew that the ideology he had spent years defending was about to be tested by reality. The voice outside continued, patient and calm. "Please, we help wounded, no fight." Iko noticed something strange. The tone wasn't harsh or commanding. It wasn't the voice of someone who wanted to cause pain. It was the voice of someone trying not to frighten them. She looked at the wounded soldiers lying on the cave floor. Some were unconscious, others were too weak to lift their heads. If the Americans wanted to kill them, they could simply throw grenades into the cave or spray it with bullets. They wouldn't need to negotiate. They wouldn't need to speak gently. Then came the sound of footsteps, careful and deliberate, moving closer to the cave entrance. The girls pressed themselves against the walls, their hearts pounding. A beam of light swept across the opening, not a muzzle flash, but a flashlight. 2 figures appeared, silhouetted against the daylight. They moved slowly, hands raised. One carried a medical bag. The other had both palms open, showing he held no weapon. Iko held her breath, waiting for the nightmare she had been promised. But instead, she saw 2 young men, barely older than the soldiers, lying wounded around her. Their uniforms were dusty and worn. Their faces were tired, not cruel. And the first thing the medic did when he stepped inside was kneel beside the nearest wounded Japanese soldier and ask, in broken Japanese, if he could help. The room froze. No one moved, no one spoke. The American medic looked up at the nurses, his eyes meeting ICO's. He didn't smile. He didn't make any sudden movements. He simply opened his medical bag and showed them the supplies inside: bandages, morphine, antiseptic. Then he turned back to the soldier, waited for a weak nod of permission, and began treating the wound with steady, practiced hands. Aiko felt something crack inside her chest. It wasn't relief. It wasn't gratitude. It was the shattering of a story she had believed without question, a story that had shaped her entire understanding of the world. And in its place came a question she had never been allowed to ask. What if everything they told us was wrong? The second American soldier knelt on the ground, making himself smaller, less threatening. He spoke in careful, simple Japanese. "We help, no hurt." One of the younger nurses, Emmy, began to cry, not from fear, but from exhaustion and confusion. She had been prepared to die. She had been taught that capture meant unspeakable suffering, but the man kneeling in front of her looked like he wanted to protect her, not harm her. Another American appeared at the entrance, carrying a crate of supplies. He set it down gently, almost reverently, as if he understood the girls were watching his every move. Inside were canned rations, water canteens, and more medical equipment. For hours, the Americans worked alongside the Japanese nurses. They moved from soldier to soldier. They didn't speak much, but their actions spoke louder than any propaganda ever could. One medic, who introduced himself as Tom, handed Aiko a roll of clean bandages and gestured toward a soldier whose arm was infected. She took the bandages with shaking hands and began to work. Tom stayed beside her, guiding her gently, showing her how to wrap the wound properly. He didn't treat her like an enemy. He treated her like a colleague, like someone whose work mattered. Yuki, who had been silent for days, finally spoke. She asked Miss Tanaka, in a whisper barely audible over the sound of distant gunfire, why the Americans were helping them. Miss Tanaka didn't have an answer. She simply shook her head, her own eyes wet with tears. Hannah, still clutching the tin of peaches one of the soldiers had given her, stared at the cave entrance as if seeing the world for the first time. The stories they had been raised on, the warnings drilled into them since childhood, had all been designed to make them fear. But fear, they were learning, could be manufactured, and truth could be hidden behind walls of lies. By evening, the cave had transformed. It was still crowded, still filled with suffering, but it no longer felt like a tomb. The Americans had brought lanterns to replace the dying candles. They had shared their rations. They had treated the wounded without regard for nationality or uniform. And when the time came to evacuate, they helped the nurses and the surviving soldiers walk out of the cave and into the fading light of day. Aiko stepped outside for the first time in what felt like weeks. The air was cool and fresh. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows across the scarred landscape. She looked back at the cave entrance, then at the American soldiers guiding them down the hillside. They moved carefully, their rifles slung over their shoulders, their hands free to help the injured. One of the soldiers, noticing Iso's exhaustion, offered her his canteen. She hesitated, then took it and drank deeply. The water was clean and cold, the best thing she had tasted in months. He nodded and moved on, not expecting thanks, not demanding anything in return. It was a small gesture, but it carried a weight she would remember for the rest of her life. Because in that moment, she understood something her teachers had never wanted her to know. The enemy was human, and humanity, even in the middle of war, could still choose kindness over cruelty. The journey down the hillside was slow and quiet. Some of the wounded had to be carried on makeshift stretchers. Others leaned on the shoulders of the medics, their strength nearly gone. The nurses walked in a tight group, still wary, still processing what had happened. They passed burned-out tanks, shattered trees, and craters filled with rainwater. The signs of battle were everywhere, but the battle itself had moved on. The Americans were securing the area, setting up aid stations, and organizing evacuations. They weren't celebrating victory. They were too tired for that. They were simply doing the work that came after the fighting stopped. That night, the nurses were brought to a field hospital where they were given food, clean water, and medical attention. Iko sat on a cot, wrapped in a blanket, staring at her hands. They were still stained with blood, but they no longer trembled. Yuki sat beside her, silent but present. Hana lay curled up nearby, already asleep, the tin of peaches still clutched in her hands. Miss Tanaka moved among the girls, checking on each of them, her face lined with exhaustion and something else, something that looked like guilt. She had believed the propaganda too. She had taught it to her students. And now she had to reckon with the fact that she had nearly led them to their deaths based on lies. The weeks that followed were strange and disorienting. The nurses were questioned, documented, and eventually allowed to return to their families, or what remained of them. Okinawa was in ruins. Entire villages had been destroyed. Tens of thousands of civilians had died, many by their own hands, convinced that capture meant a fate worse than death. The nurses had survived, but they carried the weight of what they had learned. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, and it had shattered the worldview they had been raised to accept. And they knew, even then, that their story was one of thousands, perhaps millions, of people who had been lied to by the very leaders who claimed to protect them. Decades later, when historians and journalists sought out the survivors of the student nurse corps, they found women who were still grappling with the memories. Iko, by then an elderly woman with silver hair and gentle eyes, returned to the hillside where the cave still stood. She walked slowly, using a cane, her steps careful on the uneven ground. The island was peaceful now. Children played in the fields, tourists visited the memorials, but for Iko, the echoes of that June day in 1945 had never fully faded. She stood at the cave entrance, her hand resting on the limestone, and spoke quietly to the reporter beside her. "I learned something in this cave," she said. "I learned that fear is a weapon, and the people who wanted us to fight to the death used that weapon against us." Yuki, in her own interview, spoke about the tin of peaches. "It seemed like such a small thing," she said, "but it represented something much larger. It represented a choice. The American soldier could have ignored her. He could have treated her like a threat or an inconvenience. But instead, he treated her like a human being. That choice," she said, "saved my life, not just physically, but in every other way that mattered." Hana, quieter and more reserved, spoke about the medic who had knelt in the dirt to make himself less intimidating. "He didn't have to do that," she said, "but he understood what fear does to people, and he chose to show us something different." Miss Tanaka, in her final years, admitted she had spent decades questioning herself. She wondered how many of the girls under her care might have survived if they had been taught to think critically, to question the stories they were told, to see the humanity in those they were instructed to fear. "We were children," she said softly, "and we were used not only by the war, but by the lies that made the war possible." Her voice was steady, but her eyes held the weight of regret. She had done her best in impossible circumstances, yet she could not escape knowing she had been part of a system that valued obedience over truth. The story of the Okinawan student nurses was one thread in a larger tapestry of suffering. Civilians and soldiers faced the same choice: surrender or die. Many chose death, convinced by propaganda that surrender meant cruelty or disgrace. But those who survived, like Iko and her fellow nurses, learned another truth. They discovered that fear grows fastest where questions are forbidden, and that compassion can break through hatred even in war. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Okinawa, ceremony was held at Peace Memorial Park. Veterans from both sides attended, alongside survivors and families. Aiko, Yuki, and several former student nurses stood together, older now, yet bound by memory. An American veteran, a former medic, approached them. Through a translator, he said he remembered the caves, the frightened faces, the wounded men, and the attempts to reassure civilians they were safe. He thanked the nurses for choosing trust when trust seemed impossible. Aiko shook his hand, and though words felt insufficient, the gesture carried decades of meaning. It showed that history is shaped by small human choices, moments when people decide to see one another as human rather than enemy. As the sun set over the ocean, she whispered, "We survived because someone showed us the truth, and that truth, however painful, remains a reminder that honesty can outlive fear, and compassion can outlast the lies that make war possible for those willing to look beyond what they were taught to believe." For Aiko and the others, remembering was not simply an act of grief, but a duty to the future. They hoped that by telling their story, younger generations would learn to question what they are taught and to seek truth even in difficult times. Their memories, shaped by suffering and unexpected mercy, stood as a warning that societies can be led astray when fear replaces understanding, and as a promise that courage and empathy can guide people back toward humanity.